Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to the Wix Wiz. Today we're going to be talking about this handy little element over here called Captcha or reCAPTCHA, which is a tool for making sure that the person taking a certain action on your website is indeed a human and not, let's say, a bot. And we're going to be learning how to incorporate that into a custom form that you built on your Wix website. So if you want to learn how to do all that and more, let's get started. Okay, so first thing, let's go over our setup for today. So as you can see here on my screen, I've set up a few inputs that will act as our custom form and a submit button, which will be used to submit our form. In addition, I've gone over here into our CMS and I've set up a collection that I called Captcha, and it just has two fields for this name and title field, and that's essentially what we're going to be using to collect the user data. And now what we're going to do is we're going to add in the Captcha element. So in order to do that, you'll go over here to the upper left to add element. And we're going to be looking here for input. Okay, input. And on the bottom here, you can see it's called reCAPTCHA. It's like a newer version of Captcha. I'm not going to go into it too deeply, but essentially you can just go ahead and click right over here. Okay, on where you can see here, it says I'm not a robot. And that will add the Captcha element to your canvas. And I'm just going to move down my submit button a little bit and put the Captcha right over here because I want people to do it right before they're done submitting the form. Okay, so before we continue and actually start writing any code, let's take a brief pause and talk about what this Captcha actually is, just in case you landed on this tutorial without having too much background about Captcha and you were just curious. So Captcha is essentially a tool developed, if I'm not mistaken, by Google, which is meant to prevent bots from filling out forms on your website. So basically, it's a tool to verify that the person that successfully executes the Captcha task or challenge is a human being and not a robot. And it's used to prevent bots, I don't know, Python bots from crawling websites and filling out different forms just to spam websites or for various different malicious reasons, or not so malicious, but just bots that you don't want filling out your forms on your website. And the way it works is essentially it picks up on the user's behavior as they're completing the Captcha challenge. And based on some kind of logic that the developer of the tool has determined, it decides if the person is a human or not. And if it's a human, then it will provide a certain token which verifies that it's a human, and we can use that in order to tell our website in the backend that, okay, this is a real human being that's filling out the form, and continue and submit the data. So our approach for setting up the Captcha is going to be twofold. We're going to have an implementation on the front end and in the back end. So on the front end, what we're going to do is we're primarily going to set up these event listeners over here. So on error, on timeout, and most importantly, on verified, which will fire once there is a successful verification using the Captcha. And once that verification goes through, we'll be able to get this token. Okay, so the Captcha will provide a certain token value that we can pass to the backend and run a verify function on. So here we have Wix Capture backend, and you'll notice that there's a Wix Capture v2 as well. So this is kind of a newer version of the API, which is currently in developer preview. From the brief look that I took at both of them, they do seem quite similar, just small changes in like how it's imported, but the basic implementation is the same. And the way that it works is that we have this authorized function in the backend. And what we're going to do is we are going to pass in the token that we get from the front end. And if that authorization comes back as verified, so the backend module determines that this token is valid, then we know that it's a human that filled out our form, and we can continue to process the form submission in the backend. And this is a very key part about how we're going to be setting this up, because it means that we're not going to be able to submit the data to our collection from the front end, but rather this is something that we're going to have to do in the back end only after we've verified that the person is a human, that the whatever is filling out our form is actually a human being. I've created a backend file called captcha.web.js, and notice that we're using the new web modules and not the JSW files. You could still use JSW files if you want, but just since all of the Wix documentation has turned over to the web.js, that's the examples that I'm going to be using now, just so that you can correlate between this tutorial and what you see in the Wix documentation. So here is my file, and what we're going to do here is we're essentially going to create a web method which will handle the entire submission of our form. And this submission is going to need to include two things, and that is both the data of the form and the token from our Captcha. And essentially, if we don't have a valid token from the Captcha, we're not going to proceed with processing the data from the form. So over here, we already have the import of permissions and web method because it comes default when I created this file. And here, I don't really need this example web method here. I'm going to go ahead and create my own web method. But first, let's import two things. So we're going to be importing the Captcha Wix API, and we're also going to be importing the Wix Data API. So let's do that over here. So import, let me zoom in so you can see, Wix Captcha backend. And again, you can try and experiment and use the newer version v2. Even though it's in developer preview, I'm going to use the stable version for now, but I'm not sure how long it will last. So if you're watching this tutorial sometime in the future, then and you don't see this specific module, then you can try and just adjust slightly to the newer one. And I don't think that it'll be much that you need to change. So I'm going to import that, and I'm also going to import Wix data so that we can actually submit our form if we have a verified token. Next thing I'm going to do over here is I'm going to create the web module. So I'm going to be export const, and I'll call this submit form. And this is going to be equal to a web method. And this web method is going to need two things. So we're going to need to have the permissions. So we're going to have here permissions and dot. I'm going to say anyone. So anyone can essentially call this backend function. And we're also going to, the web method. And we're also going to have a function that we pass in over here, which is essentially going to process our token. So I'm going to pass in the token here as a parameter. And I'm also going to pass in the data. Okay, so we have two, essentially we have two parameters over here. And now what we need to do over here is actually process the token and the data. Okay, so the first part of our backend will be setting up this authorized method. And essentially what this method does is it verifies that the token that we pass in from the front end is actually a token that was generated by Captcha, and it authenticates that there's a human being there and not just some random token that a malicious user might have passed in. So it takes as a parameter, it takes the token, and it will return a promise with a value of true if it was successful. Otherwise, it will throw an error. So let's go over here into the editor. And what I'm going to do first, I'm going to change this function over here into an asynchronous function so that we can handle the promise. And then what I'm going to do over here is say const success equals to await, and we're going to have the Wix Captcha backend dot authorize, and we're going to pass in our token. Okay, and I'm going to wrap this in a try catch so that we can catch if there's an error essentially and this wasn't successfully authorized. So I'm going to go through over here, and let's first handle the situation where we do have successful authorization of the token. So I'm going to say here that if success, or if, let's do it this way, if no success, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to return. Okay, I'm going to exit this function prematurely. To be honest, I think that if it's not successful, it will just go here into the catch. But because the documentation is not 100% clear, I'm just going to put this extra protection in. And the next thing we're going to do is that if we get to this point, I'm going to assume that we have the right token and we can insert the data that we received from the form into the collection. So what I'm going to do is say here const inserted item equals to await Wix data dot insert. And here we're going to need the collection ID. Okay, so for that, we're going to go over here into our public and backend code, here into databases. And I'm going to look for here our Captcha collection right over here. And I'm just going to grab the ID. Once I have that ID, I can head back over here. And I'm just going to paste that right over here as a string. And I'm going to pass in the data that we got from the front end, because that's essentially what we're going to be inserting into the collection. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in console.log inserted item, and I'll just add a little log note here. So inserted item. And what we'll do is I'll return the inserted item to the front end. Okay, so that's what we'll do over here. And let's add in some error handling, so some messages from the backend to indicate that we've had an error so we can inform the user on the front end. So what I'll do is I'll return an object which will essentially have error, and I'll say Captcha not verified. Okay, you could write something a little more eloquent for your own use case. And here, what we'll do is I'll log the error, so console.log error. And I'll also return the same message. So I'll return that Captcha not verified, because these are the two situations where I assume that the Captcha won't be verified. To be honest, though, this can also throw an error if we have a problem inserting into the collection. So what I'll do is I'll make this a little more versatile, and I'll just return the error like that. Okay, that way whatever error we get here inside of the log is the same error that I'll return to the front end, and we can display that to the user. Awesome. So this is pretty much wraps up our backend, and now we can head to the front end to set up the Captcha element there and the rest of the form submission. Okay, so here we are on the front end of our website on the page that we built the custom form. And I've gone ahead and I've given meaningful names to all of our elements. So you'll see here, for example, this is called name input, and our submit button is called submit button. Okay, so I recommend you go ahead and do that. And once you've given these all IDs right over here, then we can head over here into the IDE and start writing out the page code. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to import the web method that we built in the backend. So that's going to be submit form, and I'm going to be importing it from backend slash, and this is captcha .web. Okay, and now that we have that, we'll be able to use it later on when we're building out the handler that's going to actually submit our form. The next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that we're preventing the user, at least from a UX perspective, from attempting to submit the form before they fill out the CAPTCHA. And the way that I'm going to do that, again, there's multiple approaches that you can take to this, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the submit button, and I'm going to make sure over here that it is disabled by default. So if we take a look now, you'll see that the submit button is all grayed out. And what we're going to do is we're going to enable this button only after we've successfully gotten a token from our CAPTCHA. And this isn't our only protection against the user skipping the CAPTCHA. We obviously have our backend function, which won't be successful unless it gets a token, but at least here we won't have users like trying to submit the form when they haven't done the CAPTCHA, because that's something that definitely won't work for them. So let's first deal with the CAPTCHA itself, and we're going to do that using the unverified event of the CAPTCHA. So let me go over here back into our page code, and here inside of the onReady function, I'm going to select our CAPTCHA element, and I'm going to set up the onVerified. And again, this will only run after somebody has successfully verified themselves via the CAPTCHA. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the token that we get back from the CAPTCHA, and I'm going to store it in a global variable up here. So I'm going to say let token. And then here inside of the onVerified, I'm going to say that token should be equal to select the CAPTCHA again, dot token. Okay, so there we're storing our token as a global variable so that we can use it later on. And the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to enable our submit button. So I'm going to select the submit button, not account navbar one, but submit button dot enable. Okay, and this will make sure that the user can actually click the submit button, but only after they've actually gone through the CAPTCHA. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up this actual submit handler. So I'm going to create a new function over here on the bottom. And this is going to be an async function. And I'll call this handle submit. And it won't take any parameters. But what we'll do is we'll get the values from the inputs and store them in variables. So I'm going to say const name equals to, and I'm going to select the name input dot value. And I'm going to say const email equals to, and here I'm going to select the email input dot value. And you can see if you take a look over here that essentially I've given the variables the same names as my fields in the collection. And this is going to ease the whole submission of data to the collection later on. So I'm going to close this up here. And in order to pass this into our backend function, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to store this inside of an object called data, name and email. Because if you recall, we're going to pass this data as a parameter to our web method along with the token. So let's do that over here. So I'll say const result. Okay, so essentially the result of our submission via the backend equals to await, and this is because anything that happens using a backend web method is automatically asynchronous, whether it's asynchronous in the backend or not. So here, anytime you're using something that you've imported from the backend, you always will have the await keyword before it. So await submit form, and we're going to pass in our token, and we're going to pass in the data. And then I'll just add in a log over here that will log our result. The very last thing I want to do before we do our first round of testing is to call this handle submit function when we actually click the submit button. So let's go ahead and select the submit button. And I'll say dot on click, and I'll pass in the handle submit function. Okay? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to publish our work so far to live, and we can run some testing on our live site. Okay, so here we are on the live site, and I've opened up here inside of the dashboard our site event logs, just so we can keep track of what's going on in the back end. And here in the front end, what I'll do is I'll just open up the console over here, so we can see if we get any interesting messages in the log. So let's go ahead and test out our form. So I'm going to put in my name here, test, and test@gmail.com. And then I'll click here, I'm not a robot, which is essentially the Captcha challenge. And the challenge went through, and I took the liberty of adding a log here in the console that would log out the token. So this is the token, the very long token that comes back from the Captcha. And you can see also that our submit button has been enabled because we got this token. So now I'm going to go ahead and click submit. And now hopefully everything is going on in the back end, but I see here that I got an error. So let's take a look and see what we got there. Request failed. Status code 401. Okay, so 401. Let's take a look here at the docs. So I'm going to go here into the authorized documentation. And I can see here that I got a list of different status codes that might come through and what each one means. So here I see 401 unauthenticated, no user identity found in the past request. No user identity. No user identity. I'm going to take a look and try and figure this out, and I'll be back in a moment. Okay, so I'm back and I've made some progress. So because there wasn't much indication as to what this 401 error might be and how to actually deal with it, as opposed to the other errors, which did have a little bit of an explanation. I went ahead and I just tried to read the documentation a little more. And I did notice that there was a discrepancy here between this documentation, where it says to import Wix Captcha backend, and between the documentation here in the unverified event handler, where it says to import Wix Captcha, not Wix Captcha backend. And these are both examples within the older module. So it's not a difference between kind of the new developer preview model and old one. It's just a discrepancy in the documentation, which unfortunately has been happening to Wix a lot lately and frustrating a lot of developers. So if anybody from Wix is watching, this is a great example of things that need to be fixed. And if we head here back into the editor, you can see that I've gone ahead and I've changed this over here to Wix Captcha. And I've changed this here as well, just to add in a suppress auth to make sure that we don't have any issues when we actually submit our data to the collection in terms of permissions. So unrelated to the issue that we were having before. And then I went over here to the live site and I ran a test and it came back successful. Okay, so here I got the response, so I managed to submit to the collection after running the CAPTCHA. So now what I would like to do is just finish kind of setting up some of the other aspects of the form, such as handling if we have any CAPTCHA errors and displaying kind of a success message and error messages over here inside of this message element that we set up. So the other two event listeners that I want to set up for the CAPTCHA are the on error and the on timeout. So the on error will fire off if there's any kind of error with the CAPTCHA process, the user gets disconnected. You can read the documentation if you're interested when it'll fire. And the other one is on timeout. That means that if they completed the CAPTCHA challenge and a certain amount of time passed. So here it says 120 seconds. So if they complete the challenge, 120 seconds pass, and nothing has happened with the token and they're still on that page, then that token is expired. So they'll have to generate a new token if they want to submit the form. So let's head over here into the editor and head into our code. And right under here, I'll set up the on timeout. So first let's select the CAPTCHA and I'll say on timeout. And what we want to do here is essentially first I'm going to disable the submit button. So submit button dot disable, because if there was a timeout, they're going to need to generate a new CAPTCHA token before submitting the form. So I don't want them to accidentally click submit if they don't have a valid token. So I'm going to disable that, and I'll set our error message. So message text dot text equals to timeout. Please complete CAPTCHA again. Okay, so something along these lines. And now we'll do something similar for the on error. So I'll select this CAPTCHA dot on error. And what we'll do here is, again, I will disable the submit button just in case it did get enabled somewhere down the line there through the unverified. So I'll do submit button dot disable. And I'll add an error message to our message. So message text dot text equals to error, please complete CAPTCHA. Okay. And the last situation that I'll handle here is if we get an error from our form submission itself. So after we get back the result, I'll say here that if we get result.error, then I'll display the error in the message. So select the message text dot text equals to result.error dot toString. And if we don't have any error here, then what I'll do, so here I'll also do return. And then if we don't have an error, then what I'll do is I'll set the message to be submission successful. So let's do message text dot text equals success. Okay, I don't know. You can think of something more creative in your own project. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. Maybe some code refactoring could be done, some cleanup, but overall it looks like it should work. So I'm going to go ahead and publish this to the live site to do one final test. Okay, so here I am on the live site and we're ready to do some testing. So what I'll do is first of all, I'll go through the Captcha just so that we can test the timeout. Okay, so now we'll need to wait about 2 minutes. So this is a great chance to go ahead and like the video. If you have any questions or anything you want to share, please put them in the comments below. And if you want to see more content like this, you can go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And I'll be back in a second after 2 minutes pass and we can see what the timeout looks like. Okay, so I'm back and it's been about 1.5-ish minutes, which means that we should be seeing the timeout any second now. So this is really your last chance to go ahead and like the video if you want, and boom. Okay, so there it was. You saw the timeout went through, and first of all, there's like a very visual indication on the Captcha itself, but we also got the error message that we set up over here. And then all I would need to do is to click the Captcha again in order to reactivate the submit button. I obviously would recommend also kind of hiding this error message when it's no longer relevant, but I did just a very basic implementation, so I didn't go into that much detail. Now that we have our Captcha again, let's just fill out the rest of the form. So test and test@gmail.com. And let's try submitting our form again. So I'm going to go ahead and click submit. And you can see here that we got our success message, and we can see that we've successfully submitted our form to the collection. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. This was a basic implementation of Captcha for a custom form in Wix. Please don't forget the notes about the fact that there are several modules and the importance of kind of reading and exploring the documentation just to pick up on maybe those little nuances. I hope you found it informative. If you did, don't forget to give this a big thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more like this, and I will see you next time.